Hello and welcome back to Modeling Life in Cars. On today's episode, we're going to be building my 1978 Z-28 Camaro. It's a car that I owned in high school and made some really great memories in. If you're new or joining us for the first time, I'm Angelo Ford, host of Modeling Life in Cars. And on this show, we build scale models of vehicles that I've owned, driven, or flown in my life and tell stories that are associated with each one. The model that we're building today to represent my Z28 is this AMT Snap-Tight in 1/25th scale size. This model is actually molded in this really strange orange goldish color. And while it is a Snap-Tight and should go together pretty easy, it's going to take quite a bit of painting to get the way we want it to look. So the body of this Z28 is modeled in even more of a strange orange color than the parts are. We're going to take several coats of primer and maybe even a couple coats of blue paint to make it the color of my Z28. And we'll add in a few primer spots just to make it look more realistic. Here we have the interior bucket on the same sprue with the exhaust system and the rear axle. Gas tank molded in, and frame and unibody construction all molded as one piece. And then these wheels are actually the exact ones that I had on my Z28 as well. I do recommend these Snap-Tight kits for people that are starting up for the first time, and you can easily find those on Amazon or your local hobby store. It's always great to support your local shops. So it would seem that I accidentally misplaced the instructions to this Snap-Tight model. But like I said, Snap-Tight models go together pretty easy. You can almost figure it out just on your own how they go together. Or you can always take a pair of instructions from an older model that you built. This is a set of Snap-Tight Camaros that my son and I did a build off recently. You know, you just basically toss out the cover and then follow along on. You have an interior bucket that you're going to build. You have your how you're going to put your windows on your body, a chassis assembly, wheels go on the chassis. The chassis and wheel assembly goes on the body, along with any windows, and then the decals finally as the final step. We're going to start by painting the actual pieces on the sprues, and then we'll assemble them as the model together. So as I mentioned, this Snap-Tight model actually has the engine molded into the underside of the chassis. So there's not too much building with it. So I'm going to explain about now what I did with my real Z28. I actually bought a Z28 from a local junkyard that was completely totaled, but it had a really nice engine in it. It had a nice rear end in it. Interior was in good shape, and it had the Z28 side moldings that I really needed to put onto a base Camaro that I was looking at buying. I couldn't afford an actual Z28 in really great shape, so I bought a base model Camaro and then used all the parts from the totaled Z28, including the engine and rear end, and transferred those onto that other car. Worked out great, and I had actually ended up with a really nice ride. So this is a Snap-Tight kit, but it's nicely molded and modeled here in this weird orange color. What I'm going to do is just take some notes on my makeshift instructions on what I'm actually going to paint. So for the steering wheel, for most of the interior, that's all going to be black. The underside of the chassis, I'm going to use a Plasti Dip paint that I have that really gives it a nice undercoating look. And we'll use some aluminum, some steel, and some black for the exhaust pipes, exhaust system, and rear axle assembly. You know, you'll see as we're building this Snap-Tight here that they do go together relatively easily. They don't take a lot of skill. They're perfect put together with your kids and just, you know, a great way to help build your confidence in making models with the hobby. So I've gone and pulled out most of the paints that I'm going to be using for the build, and now we'll go into a little bit more detail on how I'm going to use each one. So we really have about 4 different types of paint that I'm going to be using during the build, and the first one are these spray paint cans, which we'll be using really to lay a coat on the underneath and cover the large interior base. Flat black, also satin black I've got over there as well. I do like to use the primer and paint in one. They work out pretty well. And then a separate primer, I do use either the, you know, the reddish primer or the gray primer, depending on the color that I'm painting the car. Since we're going to be painting this one blue, I'll go with the gray primer. Then we have these enamels. I'm a big fan of the Testors enamels. They're the little, you know, square bottles that you might remember if you built models as a kid. Then I order these online typically. These Vallejo paints, they're called, AV, I think. And you can get them sometimes at your local hobby shops if they have them, but I usually end up getting them online, pretty good deal. And I use these mostly for rust, just some of the detail work on the under chassis and in the inside of the cars as well. And then the fourth type that we'll be using is nail polish. You know, I picked these up really inexpensively as well at dollar stores or at TJ Maxx on sale type of places. You can usually get them for 99 cents for about a half of an ounce. The thing I like about nail polish is they come in really cool colors, and you can get them for a reasonable amount at places like the dollar store or TJ Maxx, that type of thing. So as I was painting the body, I noticed that the actual trunk of the car is that large tail fin that I don't like. It's both the fin and the trunk. So what I'm going to have to do is use my Dremel, and I'll just cut this large fin off of it so that I can place the trunk piece onto here and paint it with this as well. So while the parts are drying behind me in the booth, I'll take this time to tell a little bit about the actual story behind the Z-28. As I had mentioned earlier, there was actually two of them, my Camaro twins, I'd like to call them. One was a Z-28 and one was a base Camaro. And I had them parked in my foster mom's driveway, literally nose to nose, and one was in the backyard and the other one was in the actual driveway itself. And when it came time to do the swap, I had a bunch of my buddies come over. We had a big party in the yard, barbecue. We had ribs and steaks going. And we basically took both cars and swapped all the parts from the Z-28 that were better of performance onto the base level Camaro. And this is how I ended up with a really cool Z-28 for a reasonable price when I was in high school. So now I've got a base coat laid on all of the parts. And you can clearly see the difference between something I have shot some black on and the orange molding that was originally with the model. I used a basic flat black on most of the spruce parts, and then I shot a plastic dip on the chassis. And you can see that it gives it a really nice undercoating effect. And now I'm going to go through and do some fine detailing with some actual brush and enamel. So I've got a base level of detail on all of my parts, and I'm ready to start assembling them. As I mentioned earlier, though, the engine on this Snap-Tite is molded into the parts. In my actual car, I had a 350cc V8 engine, and I took that 350 into the shop in my school and machined, bored, and stroked the engine into a 383 cubic inch engine. Added a new camshaft, new pistons, new crankshaft. Basically, I completely rebuilt the engine. And when we dropped this engine back into my Z-28, there were very few cars that could keep up with me on Revere Beach Parkway. So we're nearing the build of my 1978 Z28, and the car was actually in pretty good shape. One of the things that was terrible about these old 70s Camaros was the weather stripping on both sides, passenger and driver. Whenever it would rain, whenever I would go through a drive-through car wash, anything like that, it would be like a rainstorm inside the car. no joke, soaking wet. That was really one of the few downsides of the Z28. Next, we're going to put the pinstripes and some of the decals on that my car actually had as well. So as I'm putting the decals on this car, I just remember how fun it was to own. It did have a slight hiccup with the throttle body for some reason. It would often stick. And a friend of mine borrowed it one time and she took it to school while I was fixing her car. Unfortunately for her, that was one of the days that the throttle body decided to stick. And she did a burnout nearly the entire length of the street that we lived on. And then, of course, when she got to her school parking lot, the throttle stuck and flooded the engine, and she had to get some friends to push it into the lot to be parked. Needless to say, that was the last time she'd borrowed my Z28. So here we have my completed 1978 Z28 Camaro. But as with all my cars, the story doesn't end there. You know, I owned this car, like I said, my senior year of high school. I drove back and forth to school. We'd go racing at nights on Revere Beach Parkway. I'd take it for some beach pizza at Bianchi's on Revere Beach. All around, it was just a great car to own and great car to drive during those high school years. But this Camaro met its fate in a two-step process. One, I was leaving school one day and the throttle body stuck open on me. And sure enough, I went slamming right into the front of a Jeep Cherokee. We're going to damage up the model to show what happened and what my car actually looked like. Surprisingly, it didn't do a lot of damage to my car, but it totaled the Jeep. What happened was my Z28 went underneath the bumper of the Jeep, and the Jeep Cherokee went over onto me, and the front engine pan actually punctured on the nose of my Z28. So it destroyed the entire bottom of the engine on the Jeep Cherokee, and his car was a total loss. So now we'll damage my Z28 to what it actually looked like. So here we go. It wasn't actually too bad, like I said. What happened was some of the front plastic and just the front hood got bent a little bit, and I sprayed some of the paint off. But the car was still totally drivable and wasn't too much of a problem at all. You know, the biggest thing about the accident was actually the throttle body sticking yet again. It just dawned on me how dangerous this situation was, and I couldn't actually figure out why it was doing it. So I started thinking about either replacing the intake manifold, the carburetors, or just selling the car and finding something else. In the meanwhile, thinking about what to do, I went up to see a friend in New Hampshire. And driving back on Route 93, I was probably doing about 140, 150 miles an hour, just screaming down Route 93, blaring Ozzy Osbourne, you know, just living up being a young teenager. And all of a sudden, I started to hear a pinging noise in the engine. And my experience with cars told me exactly what that probably was. So I started to back off on speeding down the highway to pull over on the side to take a look, but it was too late. Springs, lifters, all kinds of engine parts started pinging into the hood. I could see dents happening as I was driving down the freeway. And as I pulled over to the side, smoke oil started pouring out from the hood. I turned the engine off, let the car cool down, and then popped the hood, and sure enough, I had blown the entire motor. I don't know if it was the rebuild job or just not changing the oil enough. I never did figure out what it was, but off to the junkyard another car went. Well, that might be it for the 1978 Camaro, but what to follow was my 1983 Z28 Camaro. This car was great. I had it the entire time throughout college, had some great memories and some great stories, and we'll be telling those in the next episode of Modeling Life in Cars. And while you're waiting for that episode, be sure to check out our YouTube channel for some of our previous videos. Go on Facebook and engage in our page or on Instagram, and be sure to check out our Patreon channel and contribute if you can. Once again, thanks for tuning in.